Biblical Unitarian embraces fierce monotheism. And it's the type of monotheism that rejects a tripart God. We Trinitarians are also monotheistic. Sometimes our opponents forget that fact. They think that we're teaching three gods. They think that we're teaching a three-headed God. They think that we're teaching something other than what they believe is a biblical foundational truth, that there's only one God. That's why during any given debate between a Trinitarian and a non-Trinitarian, the Trinitarian would do well to start with the foundational truth in his answer that there is only one God. And I affirm that truth as well. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. What does this mean from the Hebrew into the English? This is Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. But I interpret the word one there not as one person, like Biblical Unitarian kind of assumes the verse is talking about. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one person. That's kind of how they interpret the verse when they see the word echad, one. But I don't interpret it that way. I interpret it as one God. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one God. Right? I just turned right back around and used the same word that was already used in Hebrew, which is Elohim. There's only one Elohim. There's only one God. That's the generic word for God in that verse in question. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, right? Elohim is the root word of Eloheinu, the Lord, the God of us, Eloheinu. Our God, our Elohim, is only one Elohim. So there's only one Elohim. But, like Trinitarians are fond of explaining, this Elohim is complex. He's compound in his unity. He is one God, but the Bible gives us enough evidence to make a case and come to the conclusion safely and foundationally that there are three persons. And that's where things get a little challenging. So let's look at Dr. Brown's answer to this objection that Jesus is Messiah, but at the same time, an objection that Jesus is very God. And what he's doing is he has to build a case that Isaiah is speaking of a human being that would be born into Israel's historical lineage of kings, yet at the same time, the verbiage of the passage, of the prophecy, has both a near and far aspect to it. The near being the partial fulfillment that an earthly king would satisfy the verse, that would fill up, not completely, but at least fill up the expectation from a human perspective. Yet at the same time, this messianic figure, this king that would rule Israel one day, is described not just in Isaiah, but in other places as well, as a king who has an eternal kingdom, an everlasting kingdom. And so what does Dr. Brown have to say about that? Let's pick up the answer, backing up just one little bit of a paragraph from where we left off last week. So we just got through reading in Dr. Brown's notes about this Messiah who's coming, that is a man who's going to fill up God's promises of being someone who would champion God's causes and God's kingdom and establish God's kingdom on earth, but do it supernaturally because his life is eternal. His kingdom is eternal. And the rabbis picked up on that. So don't get me wrong. There are a lot of rabbis who recognize and affirm that Messiah, that King Messiah, even though they reject Jesus as the candidate, they recognize that a lot of these passages are messianic. And to that degree, I have to even also say this, and to your credit, Biblical Unitarian, you guys listening again? Did you tune me out yet? Please come back, listen up. You guys embrace Isaiah as messianic as well. I mean, Baruch Hashem, yes, absolutely. I mean, there are many rabbinic Jews who reject Isaiah as referring to King Messiah. And so at least Biblical Unitarian embraces this Jesus as the one spoken of in Isaiah. Even though they don't think he's divine, at least they believe it's Jesus. So bless you guys for that. Yeah, I'm glad you guys are on our side, or we're on the same side. So Dr. Brown says that all this culminates, with Zechariah 14, 3-5. We've been talking about how that Jesus is God or Jesus is human, and how can he be both at the same time? These promises in the Tanakh, they culminate in Zechariah 14, where the text states that the Lord, meaning Yahweh, will go forth and fight against all the nations that come against Jerusalem. And on that day, his feet, meaning Yahweh's, by context, will stand on the Mount of Olives east of Jerusalem, and the Mount of Olives will be split in two from east to west, forming a great valley with half the mountain moving north and half moving south. Then the Lord my God will come and all the holy ones with him. And so we're talking about a time frame that probably corresponds with the Battle of Armageddon near the end of the 70th week of Daniel, near the end of the 7-year tribulation, but more importantly, near the end of the 30-day time period when God will be sending his son back to do battle with the Antichrist. And so we read in the book of Revelation right around chapter 19. I'm sorry, not chapter 19. Well, yeah, chapter 19 is the Armageddon passage, but earlier than that, I think it's chapter 14, we read about the 144,000 and Yeshua standing, the Lamb, standing on the Mount of Olives, seen on Mount Olives. And that probably corresponds with the Zechariah passage with God being described as his feet standing on the Mount of Olives. Either that or Revelation 19, where Jesus returns on a white horse and then lands down on the Mount of Olives, gets off his horse, and does battle with the Antichrist. Something to that effect. But we're not here to talk about eschatology right now. That was the previous study. Dr. Brown says, Dr. Brown says, verses such as these present only two choices. Either Yahweh himself visibly and physically will descend onto the Mount of Olives. That's a proposition, a perspective that forms a bit of a challenge to biblical Unitarian, because they don't believe that God can incarnate himself, at least not in the sense of being the person described in these passages. At least I think they do. I'm not exactly sure how they spin their eschatology at times, because passages like these in Zechariah are either anthropomorphic descriptions of God giving him body parts like humans do. That's what I mean by anthropomorphic. And if Yahweh himself visibly and physically is landing on Mount of Olives, then we have a case where it's God, but he looks like a human. Similar to what happened in Genesis 18, where God shows up outside the oaks of Mamre and has a meal with Abraham. Most biblical Unitarians would say that this is God, and they would say that this means this is not Jesus incarnate, a pre-incarnate Jesus that had a meal with Abraham, meaning God can incarnate himself, but not incarnate himself. Right? They kind of have to spin it both ways, because if they say that it's incarnation, well, then they just agreed that it's possible and probable and likely that Jesus is very God incarnate, because God can incarnate himself. But instead, what they do is they backpedal just a little bit and say, it's not that God incarnates himself, but instead he just appears as human. It's an apparition? Or no, they say it's God turning into a human, but not becoming human. He's just solidifying what he normally is from a spirit into. In other words, they're kind of fudging on the word incarnation, which is not even necessary. So that becomes a problem with them describing Yahweh himself physically touching down on the Mount of Olives. Or Dr. Brown says it's Yeshua the Messiah, who is the very image of God and the fullness of God in bodily form, who will come in the clouds with his holy ones and put his feet on the Mount of Olives. And of course, that is an interpretation that biblical Unitarianism soundly rejects, right? But then what do they do with the passages in the New Testament that I was just mentioning in the book of Revelation, where Jesus is described as the Lamb standing on the Mount of Olives? If we have time later on, maybe I'll show you those passages, but I don't want to digress just yet. So let's keep reading Dr. Brown's answer. This is kind of where we left off last week. What about Micah 5:2, which is verse 1 in your English Bible? We've got about 5 minutes left in the study, so we'll just keep working our way through Dr. Brown's answer until we find a natural stopping point, and then we'll break off. I don't think we're going to finish his answer because it's quite lengthy. What about Micah 5:2? Does this text also point to the divine nature and eternal origin of the Messiah? Let's read the passage as it shows up in the KJV. The classic language of the King James Version, reflected in many subsequent Christian versions, affirms the divinity of the Messiah. Let's read it. This is Dr. Brown's answer to the objection by Rabbinic Judaism that Jesus can't be the Messiah, the Messianic candidate spoken of in the Tanakh. And more importantly, even if he is the Messianic, even if the prophecies are speaking of Messiah, like many Rabbinic Jews do embrace, it's still not Jesus who is some God-man, who's God incarnate, that it's talking about. In other words, it's helpful for you to understand that, like biblical Unitarian believes, Rabbinic Judaism most of them embrace a human Jesus. Let's try that one again. They would hate for me to say that. They embrace a human Messiah. So they're looking for a Messiah to come who's human. They're not looking really for a divine Messiah. Although there are ancient rabbis, which I'll show you one of these days, who did embrace a Messiah who is divine. But they don't call him God. They just they give him a category somewhere be higher than man, but lower than God. All right, so Dr. Brown says, quoting from the Micah passage, "But thou, Bethlehem Ephratah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall he come forth unto me, that is to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth," are you ready for this? "have been from of old, from everlasting." End quote. So let's read the interpretation. Dr. Brown says, this rendering is normally interpreted to mean that the Messiah, who is an uncreated, eternal being, would be physically born in the obscure little town of Bethlehem. Most Jewish translations, however, and a number of Christian translations, right? Biblical Unitarianism is a Christian denomination, but they're non-Trinitarian. These types of translations read the text very differently. For example, the NJPSV, which stands for New Jewish Publication Society Version, which I had pulled up for you and showed you in previous studies. It translates this verse this way, quote, "And you, Bethlehem of Ephrath, least among the clans of Judah, from you shall come one forth to rule Israel for me, whose origin is from old, from ancient times." Now, notice what they do. What they do is they divide the verse up in such a way that God the Father, they do the same thing as with the Isaiah passage, so that God is speaking of this Messiah who's human, but God adds his own editorial comment at the very end, separated by the little dash there, one whose origins from old, from ancient times. So, from you shall come forth to rule Israel for me, and then dash, one whose origin is from old, whose ancient times. In other words, that part of the passage is given back to God. This is what they did with the Isaiah passage as well. They put the language, in fact, I do have to show you this, otherwise you guys aren't following what I'm talking about. In the NJPS V version, the revised JPS version, which came out last year in 2023, which I've got pulled up on my screen right now, which is available online at safaria.org, which is a non-messianic resource. It's a very helpful resource, safaria.org, but just be aware that it's non-messianic. So they reproduce resources that are valuable to rabbinic Jews and religious Jews and even secular Jews who are seeking spirituality. They include a lot of valuable resources that I can recommend, but you just have to remember they're non-messianic, so no Christian axe to grind here. So what do they have to say about Isaiah 9? Speaking of the verse that we're studying, Isaiah 9 says, "For a child has been born to us, a son has been given to us, and authority has settled on his shoulders. He has been named." Now listen to the way they spin the verse. "The mighty God is planning grace." So what they do is they don't even give that title back to the messianic child at all. They just simply say, this child has been named. And then they talk about God, the mighty God, planning grace. That's what they say. Who is the writer Isaiah speaking about? It's speaking about God. Who is God? The mighty God. What is he doing? He's planning grace by bringing this child to the Israelites at the time. Okay, so that's the way they translate it. And then the second line, the eternal Father, comma, a peaceable ruler. Meaning by context, the planning verb from the first clause is carried down into the second clause. The mighty God is planning grace. The eternal Father is planning to send, right, a peaceable ruler. He's going to send. He's going to give us this peaceable ruler. Like I said earlier, a son has been given, a child has been born, a son has been given, and this given son is a peaceable ruler that has been given to us and born to us and named by the mighty God, the eternal Father. So none of the titles really perhaps directly deal with the Son, although maybe a peaceable ruler could be referring to God, could be referring to the child, the eternal Father, who is a peaceable ruler. We'd have to read the next verses. In a token of abundant authority and peace without limit upon David's throne. So it's hard to say, but either way, the point I'm trying to make is that they're doing something similar in Malachi about taking anything that smacks of resembling some type of an exalted eternal figure, such as an incarnated God, and they're just turning that right back around and giving it to God, who is the only one that they can be certain is eternal. Let's keep reading and finish out this particular paragraph, and then we've run out of time for our study tonight. We'll just have to keep chugging along and pick this up next week. So Dr. Brown says that the rabbinic interpretation would mean the Davidic king. And then in question, it says the Messiah, because remember, half of rabbinic Judaism rejects this figure as Messiah. The other half embraces it as Messiah. The half that rejects it says this is simply an earthly ruler like Hezekiah or Manasseh or somebody like that. But this would mean that the Davidic king had his origins in the obscure town of Bethlehem many years ago, back in the ancient time of David, who lived 3 centuries prior to Micah. I think that is probably, let's pause with this teaser. Dr. Brown says, so which translation is right in Micah here? And you can see on the screen, I'm leaving part of the answer. Excuse me. I'm leaving part of the answer there for you to see what I'm going to talk about, but I'll save the discussion till next week. We'll leave off right here. It's a great place to pause. So that'll do it for a Trinitarian response to biblical Unitarianism.